Lord Pendleton's manor had always been a place where tradition and ceremony seemed to stretch the hours, bending the sunlight and the wind to an older, quieter rhythm. On this particular morning, a fog lay thick over the estate, muting the greens of the gardens and muffling the distant sound of the river. Inside, the great house hummed with a peculiar tension, a tension that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with a discovery that had shaken the household to its core. Lady Marjorie, the housekeeper, had found Sister Beatrice collapsed in the library, the pages of an old hymn book scattered around her like startled birds. It was the first mystery, though none knew it yet, that would lead to the heart of a far stranger tale. When Miss Marple arrived, summoned at the insistence of Lord Pendleton himself, the scene was already staged with the meticulous care of a household used to its own routines. The library was a large room, lined with shelves that bore the weight of centuries of history. Heavy velvet drapes dulled the light coming through the windows, and the familiar scent of old leather and polished wood hung in the air. Sister Beatrice, though not seriously harmed, seemed shaken, clutching the hymn book as if it were a talisman. The peculiar part, however, was not her condition, but the single object lying on the desk beside her, a small ivory crucifix with a strange inscription in a language Miss Marple did not immediately recognize. "I found it just like this, Miss Marple," Sister Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. I don't understand. It wasn't here yesterday. I would have noticed it." Her eyes darted nervously toward the heavy curtains and then to the desk again. "I keep my quarters strictly for prayer and study. Nothing else should be out of place." Miss Marple noted the careful wording, the slight tremor in her hands, and the way her eyes sought reassurance. It was never the obvious clue that led her to the truth. It was always the subtle discord in behavior, the almost imperceptible shift in the ordinary. Her gaze traveled slowly around the room. The desk was locked when she arrived, yet this crucifix sat atop it as though deliberately placed. There were no signs of forced entry, no disturbance on the desk's surface, and yet the object seemed intended to convey a message. Lord Pendleton, a stern man with the faintest trace of unease in his eyes, stood nearby, wringing his hands. "It defies all reason, Miss Marple," he said. "The nun assures me she did not touch the crucifix. And yet here it is. There's no sign that anyone entered the library overnight, and the windows were fastened as they always are. If this is some prank, it is most elaborate." Miss Marple smiled faintly, not in amusement, but in the calm of someone who thrived on unravelling such intricacies. "Sometimes, Lord Pendleton, the simplest explanation is hidden beneath layers of the obvious. The question we must ask ourselves is not how the object arrived here, but why it needed to be noticed at this precise moment." The first thing she did was examine the crucifix itself. Its craftsmanship was exquisite, far too refined for something meant to be a mere trinket. The inscription, though foreign at first glance, bore an unmistakable pattern. Miss Marple traced her finger along the delicate grooves, recognizing a cipher she had encountered in a minor clerical scandal many years ago. A note had been hidden within the object, tiny, nearly invisible markings that, when deciphered, spelled out the word Aquila. She frowned slightly, making a mental note. Names in isolation were meaningless, yet the precision of their placement often spoke louder than words. Turning to the hymn book, she noticed something subtle that had been overlooked in the initial excitement, a small smudge of ink on the edge of the page, as if a quill had been accidentally dragged. The smudge formed a barely discernible arrow pointing toward the back of the shelf. Miss Marple quietly rose, moving with the grace of someone who had walked through countless rooms filled with secrets. Behind a row of dust-heavy tomes, she found a small envelope, yellowed with age but still intact. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, on which was written a cryptic message in Sister Beatrice's handwriting, though the phrasing was unusual. "Not all devotions are witnessed, yet some bear witness to all." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. This was no ordinary note. She knew that the words of someone steeped in the discipline of prayer and contemplation could serve as either a confession or a diversion, and the placement of the crucifix, deliberate, precise, unavoidable, was a message meant for someone who could read the signs. She began to sense a connection between the seemingly random object, the cipher, and this quietly ominous note. Lord Pendleton's own movements betrayed his anxiety. He paced, muttering about the recent arrival of a visiting scholar, an expert in ancient liturgies, and how Sister Beatrice had been seen conversing with him late into the evening. Miss Marple, listening carefully, recognised the significance of the name that the Lord's lips had barely formed. The scholar, she realised, was the link to the cryptic word Aquila. "He is young, bright and ambitious," Lord Pendleton admitted, "and yet utterly trustworthy, or so we believed." A knock on the library door interrupted their conversation. It was the local constable, a man well-meaning, but easily flustered, carrying yet more reports from the household staff. He spoke haltingly, noting that one of the windows had, in fact, been slightly ajar in the small morning room adjacent to the library, a detail overlooked in the initial examination. Miss Marple's mind raced. If someone had entered that way, the entry was subtle enough to evade most attention, yet deliberate enough to ensure that a specific item was found. She knelt to inspect the hinges of the morning room window and found faint traces of mud on the sill, indicating that someone had used the garden to reach it. And yet the footprints, oddly, were a near-perfect match for Sister Beatrice's shoes. Miss Marple's lips pursed in thought. This was either a remarkable coincidence or an intentional misdirection. She would need to test this. Later that evening she asked to see the nuns' quarters. The small room, immaculate and serene, offered little in the way of clues, yet the pattern of objects, rosary beads precisely aligned, prayer cards carefully stacked, and a small wooden box at the foot of the bed, spoke volumes to Miss Marple. The box, locked, bore the same faint carvings as the crucifix. With Sister Beatrice's hesitant consent, she opened it, revealing a cache of letters, carefully folded and dated. Among them was one letter marked with the same cryptic word, Aquila. Miss Marple pieced the story together quietly in her mind. Someone had wanted the nun to feel a threat, to receive a message framed as a mystery but in reality a carefully orchestrated warning. The crucifix, the cipher, the misplaced smudge of ink, they were all part of a chain designed to lead the innocent to a revelation without ever speaking it aloud. By the time supper was served, Miss Marple had spoken privately with Lord Pendleton. She explained that the unusual clue was not evidence of intrusion by a malicious outsider, but a communication from within the house, an attempt to warn Sister Beatrice of a scholarly dispute over a manuscript of rare liturgical significance. The scholar's ambition, coupled with the nun's possession of crucial knowledge, had created the perfect storm for this seemingly unsolvable event. "What amazes me," Miss Marple added, "is how little is ever random in a house like this. Every object, every gesture, even the faintest smudge, can be a voice speaking if one listens carefully enough." By nightfall, the immediate confusion had given way to a fragile calm. The crucifix was returned to its rightful place, the letters carefully secured, and Sister Beatrice reassured. The fog outside lifted slightly, revealing a sliver of moonlight over the garden, as if the world itself acknowledged the resolution of a puzzle that, on the surface, had seemed utterly impenetrable. Miss Marple, sipping her tea in the quiet of the drawing-room, allowed herself a small smile. The unsolvable crime, at least for now, had spoken its secrets, and all that remained was the delicate task of understanding the human intentions woven beneath its mysterious surface. The morning sun crept hesitantly through the tall windows of Pendleton Manor, casting long, soft shadows across the polished floors. Miss Marple, having spent the previous evening reviewing every detail, returned quietly to the library, this time with a sharper sense of purpose. While the household busied itself with breakfast and Lord Pendleton fretted over the delicate reputation of his estate, she allowed her eyes to linger on the minutiae others often overlooked, the slight scratch along the edge of a mahogany table, a dustless patch on an otherwise settled shelf, the subtle difference in how light fell on the crucifix now returned to its place. Each observation, small in isolation, began to knit together a pattern that only someone accustomed to reading human behaviour could interpret. Sister Beatrice arrived shortly after, her steps hesitant yet measured. She carried herself with the same composed grace as always, but her hands betrayed the tension Miss Marple had learned to read. The nun's eyes flicked repeatedly to the far corner of the room, a corner that had, until now, seemed unremarkable. Miss Marple noted it with quiet interest. There, almost hidden behind a tall stack of theological tomes, lay a small embroidered handkerchief, plain, white, yet distinctly out of place in the otherwise pristine library. She crouched, gently lifting it without disturbing the surrounding order, and found a faint trace of ink on the fabric. The pattern was irregular, almost accidental, yet in combination with the earlier smudge in the hymn book, it suggested deliberate communication. Lord Pendleton, entering the library with an air of controlled impatience, drew a quick glance at Miss Marple. "Do you believe it possible that someone is playing games with us, Miss Marple?" he asked. "That these signs, this crucifix, the letters, the smudges, are meant to mislead?" "Sometimes, Lord Pendleton," she said, her voice calm but edged with certainty. "What appears to be a diversion is in fact a message waiting to be read. One does not need to chase phantoms when the truth is quietly in plain sight." She placed the handkerchief on the desk, noting how the morning light illuminated the almost imperceptible ink marks. "Observe how these small, seemingly insignificant details correspond with one another. They mark a path, albeit one designed for a careful eye rather than a hasty one." As the household staff moved about, delivering tea and tidying the shelves, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the scholar who had been under suspicion, Mr. Adrian Fairfax. He appeared calm, almost unnervingly so, yet the tension in his jaw and the restless movement of his fingers betrayed more than the casual observer might notice. While the local constable had been content to record alibis and check doors, Miss Marple observed Fairfax's subtle attempts to avoid direct eye contact with Sister Beatrice. There was a deliberate avoidance, as if he feared recognition, yet he remained close enough to assert innocence. It was a delicate dance, one she had seen many times before. "Miss Marple," Fairfax said, approaching with a polite, controlled smile, "I trust your stay at Pendleton Manor has been comfortable, despite the peculiar circumstances." His tone was measured, almost rehearsed, yet the slight quiver in his left hand betrayed an underlying anxiety. "Comfortable, Mr. Fairfax," she replied, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, "though I confess the peculiar circumstances intrigue me more than the comforts. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual yesterday? Any movement or sound in the library that struck you as out of place?" He hesitated, a flicker of something she could not immediately identify crossing his face, a hesitation so brief that only a practised observer could detect it. "No, nothing at all," he said firmly, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker toward the handkerchief on the desk. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple did not miss it. After Fairfax withdrew, ostensibly to confer with Lord Pendleton about scholarly arrangements, Miss Marple allowed her attention to roam again. The crucifix, the letters, the ink smudges, and now the handkerchief. These were the threads of a web, and she began to sense the invisible design connecting them. More striking, however, was the reaction of the household staff. The maid, a quiet girl with a tendency to observe rather than speak, had lingered longer than necessary when arranging the books, her glance shifting repeatedly toward the scholar's study. The cook, who usually remained disinterested in the movements of scholars and nuns alike, had abruptly appeared in the corridor, offering unsolicited information about deliveries and unusual visitors. These minor deviations, easily dismissed by others, hinted at tensions and knowledge unspoken. Miss Marple, with the precision of someone reading a familiar language, returned to the crucifix. She examined the grooves again, realizing that the cipher was not merely a word but a combination of letters and subtle symbols indicating time and place. Each mark corresponded to an event in the recent past, one known only to someone with intimate access to both Sister Beatrice and the manuscript in question. The presence of the crucifix in the library was not random. It was meant to be seen, to alert the nun, and perhaps to test the vigilance of others. A sudden sound, a light footstep on the stairs, drew her attention. Sister Beatrice froze, her lips parted slightly in surprise. Miss Marple followed the subtle cues. A hesitation in the movement, a muffled exhalation. From the staircase descended one of the junior staff, holding a tray but casting furtive glances at the library shelves. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. The individual's behaviour was not consistent with mere nervousness. There was an awareness of the items in the library, an implicit knowledge that something hidden had been discovered. "Good morning," she said softly, her tone deliberately casual, though her mind pieced together every nuance of posture, gesture, and expression. I hope you have not been startled by our little investigation. It seems at times that even the smallest objects can reveal great secrets." The junior staffer's eyes widened fractionally, a subtle acknowledgement of guilt or fear. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had methodically retraced the path of each person connected to the library: Lord Pendleton, the nun, the visiting scholar, and the household staff. Each interaction, each movement, and each seemingly insignificant object revealed new facets of intent and awareness. The handkerchief, now fully examined under bright daylight, carried traces of ink that formed a secondary message when viewed at a particular angle, a code that revealed not a threat but a warning, a reminder of something lost, misplaced, or misunderstood. Miss Marple knew that the first signs of deception were always the quietest. Fairfax's feigned composure, the maid's lingering glances, the cook's sudden interest, all suggested awareness of circumstances they hoped to control. Yet none had truly understood that the nun had, knowingly or not, become the keeper of knowledge that others coveted. The pattern was emerging, but its full significance remained just out of reach, like a shadow cast by the morning sun. By late afternoon, Miss Marple summoned Lord Pendleton and Sister Beatrice once more. She outlined her observations, carefully noting how the placement of objects, the faint smudges and the reactions of those around them indicated an attempt to manipulate attention. "The key," she said gently, "is to see not only what is present, but what is absent. What is deliberately hidden speaks as loudly as what is displayed." Her tone suggested reassurance, though beneath it lay the quiet thrill of someone closing in on understanding. She instructed that the library remain undisturbed for the next few hours and moved herself to a vantage point near the window. From here, she could observe the comings and goings in the garden and the manor corridors, knowing full well that those attempting to manipulate events often reveal themselves through impatience, missteps, or excessive curiosity. It was a quiet, controlled form of surveillance, one that required patience but promised clarity. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, golden streaks across the room, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. The pieces were beginning to align: the unusual crucifix, the cryptic letters, the handkerchief, and the reactions of the household were no longer random incidents, but a tapestry of intention. The first real signs of deception had been observed, subtle yet unmistakable, and the next movements in this quiet, precise investigation would reveal the full extent of the plan, though, as always, it would require a careful and keen eye to discern which threads led to the truth. Miss Marple had spent the evening reviewing her notes by the glow of the study lamp, carefully arranging the strands of evidence into an invisible web. The crucifix, the ciphered letters, the ink smudges, and the misplaced handkerchief were no longer isolated mysteries. They were fragments of a deliberate communication, and now it was time to confront the human element behind them. Morning came grey and still, the fog over Pendleton Manor clinging stubbornly to the hedges and garden paths. Miss Marple summoned the key players to the drawing-room, a space both formal and intimate, where furniture and portraits alike bore witness to generations of family history. Lord Pendleton arrived first, his face a mask of restrained anxiety. "I must confess, Miss Marple," he began, voice low, "I find myself at a loss. The nun insists she knows nothing beyond her duties. The scholar is polite but evasive. Even the staff, well, they seem frightened of shadows." He paused, glancing toward the open French windows that led to the garden. "It is as if everyone is keeping secrets, yet no one will speak plainly." Miss Marple nodded. "Secrecy often has its reasons, Lord Pendleton. Our task is to listen closely, to notice what is said, what is omitted, and how the words themselves are shaped. Deception, like water, flows around obstacles. It is not always in the grand gestures, but in the tiny ripples it leaves behind." She turned first to Sister Beatrice, who seated herself with a hesitant grace. "Sister," Miss Marple said softly, "I would like to hear again about the events in the library. Who came to visit you yesterday, and what were your interactions with them?" The nun's hands folded neatly in her lap. "I spent the day with my usual prayers and study," she began, voice steady. "Father Anselm visited briefly, as he does every week. Mr. Fairfax came in the afternoon to discuss the manuscripts. I do not recall anyone else entering the library. Her gaze flicked toward the window, toward the garden beyond. The crucifix. I found it there, as you saw. I touched nothing else. I swear it. Miss Marple observed her closely. The words were carefully measured, rehearsed perhaps, but her eyes betrayed a tension that suggested more than she admitted. The slight hesitation before mentioning Mr. Fairfax's visit hinted at a particular sensitivity, as though she expected questions that she wished to avoid. "Did you notice anything unusual during Mr. Fairfax's visit?" Miss Marple asked, tilting her head in the soft light. Sister Beatrice paused. "He seemed troubled by something in the manuscripts, but he said nothing of consequence. I thought it nothing to remark upon." Her hands trembled slightly, and Miss Marple made a mental note. If she were concealing something, it might be the nature of Fairfax's interest in the manuscripts. Next, Miss Marple turned to Mr. Fairfax himself. The young scholar adjusted his coat, a faint flush colouring his cheeks despite the calmness of his expression. "Miss Marple, I assure you my visit was purely academic," he began. "I was concerned with cataloguing the manuscripts, particularly those relating to rare liturgies. There is no other motive." "Did you see the crucifix or the letters?" Miss Marple asked gently. Fairfax's lips tightened. "I may have glanced at the letters, but only insofar as they pertained to the manuscripts." He hesitated, eyes flicking towards Sister Beatrice, a subtle flicker of impatience or perhaps worry. "I am eager to cooperate fully," he added quickly, too quickly. The eagerness itself seemed a signal, a small tremor betraying concealed concern. Miss Marple made a note of the contradiction. While he insisted on transparency, his body language and the speed with which he volunteered information suggested an anxiety inconsistent with a purely innocent mind. Some truths, she knew, could be teased out through observation rather than interrogation, but the inconsistencies demanded closer scrutiny. The household staff were next. The maid, young and nervous, approached in a manner that betrayed both timidity and a strange sort of awareness. I did my usual rounds," she stammered, avoiding eye contact. "I didn't see anyone enter the library except Mr. Fairfax, as Sister Beatrice said, and perhaps the cook, but she only passed through briefly." "Did you notice anything amiss in the library, in the items on the shelves or the desk?" Miss Marple asked, keeping her tone neutral. The maid hesitated, fingers twisting nervously. I thought perhaps something was strange with the crucifix. It wasn't there before, I think. But I didn't touch anything." Her hesitation, the lack of certainty, suggested she had noticed more than she was willing to admit. Miss Marple filed this in her mind. Small discrepancies often revealed the invisible threads of events when all else seemed mundane. The cook, a robust woman with a frank face, added her own version, leaning slightly on the arm of a chair. "I saw the scholar coming in and out of the library more than once," she said firmly. "I was busy in the kitchen, but I noticed him. He seemed in a hurry. And yesterday afternoon I heard someone moving in the garden when no one should have been out there. I didn't see who, but—" Her voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The voices were beginning to form a pattern, yet each story contained deviations. Sister Beatrice's omission of any observation of the garden, Fairfax's overeagerness, the maid's uncertainty, and the cook's half-remembered sounds. Each person was truthful in part, but each also withheld or altered details. The interplay of these partial truths was the essence of deception. Sometimes the human voice is less about what is spoken than what is left unsaid, Miss Marple said, more to herself than to the others. She noted the slight stiffening of Fairfax's posture, the subtle shifting of Sister Beatrice's hands, and the way the maid's eyes darted toward the door as if weighing escape. We must also consider motive, opportunity, and the alignment of small actions with those motives. Each of you has moved through this house with purpose, consciously or unconsciously, and each movement leaves traces in the behaviours of others. Lord Pendleton, still anxious, leaned forward. "Do you believe someone is attempting to mislead us?" he asked, voice low. Miss Marple's gaze swept across the room. "I believe someone has sought to communicate without speaking plainly, to draw attention through indirect means. It is subtle, but not beyond recognition. The crucifix, the ciphered letters, even the handkerchief. They are all signals, yet not all are intended for the same eyes. Someone here wished to warn, someone wished to deceive, and in the same act the story became more tangled. We must untangle it carefully, listening not only to the words but to the reactions they provoke. She turned her attention once more to Fairfax, allowing a silence to settle between them. The young man's discomfort became palpable under her steady scrutiny. Miss Marple had learned that patience often yielded more than immediate questioning. People revealed their own truths in pauses, in slips, in micro-expressions. The scholar shifted his weight, glanced involuntarily toward the nun, and opened his mouth as though to speak, but the words faltered. Meanwhile, the minor contradictions among the household staff began to coalesce into a subtle map of movements. The maid's nervousness suggested observation of something she feared to reveal. The cook's anecdotal testimony hinted at movement in the garden, coinciding with Fairfax's repeated appearances near the window. Sister Beatrice's careful wording suggested awareness of danger, or at least of tension surrounding the manuscripts. Miss Marple recognized the delicate interplay of timing, presence, and omission, the very threads that concealed the truth beneath layers of polite conversation. By late afternoon, Miss Marple sat quietly, letting the voices of the witnesses echo in her mind. Each version of events was partially true, partially misleading. Yet the contradictions, the hesitations, and the fleeting glances, these were the markers of deception, the subtle fingerprints left by human intent. She realized that someone had orchestrated a scenario in which appearances and reality diverged, using ordinary objects and routine behavior to craft messages both visible and hidden. In the fading light, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The crucifix was more than a religious artifact, the letters more than mere correspondence, the handkerchief more than a forgotten cloth. Each was a node in a network of intention, linking scholar, nun, and staff in a delicate dance of concealment and revelation. The voices of deception had spoken, and Miss Marple had listened. Now, the next step was to uncover why those voices had been raised in such careful tones, and what secrets lay behind the intricate veil of truth and half-truths. Miss Marple spent the evening in her quiet corner of the drawing-room, the fire casting a soft glow across the worn rug and the brass fixtures. She had listened to the accounts of Sister Beatrice, Mr. Fairfax, the household staff, and Lord Pendleton, yet the voices of deception persisted like faint echoes, each carrying fragments of truth buried beneath intention. What fascinated her now was not the sequence of events itself, but the motives hidden within, motives that gave shape to otherwise inexplicable behavior. Each person in Pendleton Manor had a reason, or perhaps several, for their conduct, and the task was to disentangle these overlapping impulses. Lord Pendleton had insisted upon summoning Miss Marple precisely because the disturbance in the library threatened more than the peace of the house. The manuscripts were rare, of historical and religious value beyond simple monetary appraisal, and their significance extended to the reputation of the family itself. As Miss Marple carefully reviewed the chronology of visitors and movements, she began to recognize the subtle interplay of greed, ambition, and the need for control. Lord Pendleton, for all his concern, had himself a vested interest in the outcomes, not merely the safety of his household, but the protection of family legacy. Sister Beatrice, the dutiful nun, seemed above reproach on the surface, yet Miss Marple had noted the faint flickers of hesitation in her accounts. The nun's knowledge of the manuscripts placed her in a position of both power and vulnerability. Greed, in this instance, was unlikely to be material. It was the guardianship of secrets, the possession of knowledge, and the weight of responsibility. A misstep, even a minor one, could damage not only her own reputation, but also the standing of the church and the manor. Fear, then, was a motive as strong as any other. Fear of exposure, fear of misunderstanding, and fear of manipulation by those whose interest in the manuscripts might be less than pious. Mr. Fairfax presented the most complex puzzle. Young, intelligent, and ambitious, he had arrived under the guise of scholarly pursuit. Yet ambition, Miss Marple knew, often walks hand in hand with desire. He had access, opportunity, and a plausible interest in the manuscript's content. But ambition alone was insufficient. There were subtle indicators of something deeper. The slight tremor in his voice when speaking of Sister Beatrice, the way he lingered too long over certain phrases, the eagerness to volunteer explanations, all hinted at a personal stake beyond mere scholarship. Could there have been rivalry with another academic, a desire to claim recognition, or perhaps a personal debt, secret and pressing, that compelled him to manipulate events carefully while appearing cooperative? Each possibility warranted careful consideration. Even the household staff, usually dismissed as peripheral observers, held threads of motivation. The maid's nervousness suggested either fear of reprimand or complicity in something she did not fully understand. The cook's forthrightness might mask a subtle protective instinct, guarding the household from disruption, or it might hint at resentment toward the intrusion of outsiders into a domestic routine she valued. Human behavior rarely exists in a vacuum, and Miss Marple understood that each action, each hesitation, could carry the weight of unseen pressures, ambitions, and loyalties. Miss Marple began to map these motives mentally, aligning them with known movements and opportunities. The crucifix, placed deliberately on the library desk, could be read as a warning or a signal, a tool of communication rather than a weapon. Who stood to gain from its presence? Who needed Sister Beatrice to notice, and why? Fairfax's repeated appearances near the library and windows suggested he had some knowledge of the object, or at least of the effect it would produce. Perhaps he hoped to test the nun's awareness, to provoke a response that might reveal her knowledge or weaknesses. Lord Pendleton, for all his composure, was not free of tangled motives either. Preserving the integrity of the family's holdings was paramount, but so was the preservation of reputation. Any misstep, misinterpretation of events, exposure of secrets, or perceived incompetence among staff could unravel decades of careful stewardship. The motive of self-preservation, interlaced with paternal pride, formed a delicate lattice of intention that touched the lives of every household member. Miss Marple understood that such motives were rarely voiced, but their presence influenced every decision, every word, every hesitation. As she sifted through these threads, Miss Marple's attention returned to the letters hidden in the wooden box beneath Sister Beatrice's bed. Each one contained coded references to historical liturgies, but beneath the learned phrasing lay subtle cues, references to past scholarly disputes, mentions of prior visits by unknown correspondents, and occasional hints of disagreement over interpretations. It became evident that the manuscripts themselves were the nexus around which ambition and fear intertwined. Some sought recognition, some control, and some merely wished to safeguard knowledge, but all were drawn to the objects like moths to a flame. Miss Marple also considered the timing of events. The appearance of the crucifix, the smudges on the hymn book, the ink on the handkerchief, and the movements of Fairfax all suggested deliberate orchestration, yet there was no single theory that could account for every observation. Greed explained some behavior, fear others, and ambition others still, but no single motive spanned the entire tapestry. It was the layering of motives, the overlapping of interests and fears, that made the scenario so perplexing and, to the untrained eye, seemingly impossible to untangle. The detective's mind worked in quiet loops, examining alibis against known schedules, reconciling staff testimonies with the movements of Fairfax and the nun, and cross-referencing the subtle cues in letters and objects. Contradictions became guides rather than obstacles. A hesitation in speech suggested anxiety over exposure. An over-eager offer to assist indicated concealment of knowledge. The presence of a misplaced item, whether crucifix, handkerchief, or ink-smudged page, was both a literal and symbolic marker, pointing toward a motive otherwise unspoken. Miss Marple began to recognize patterns forming across the different testimonies. Sister Beatrice's caution aligned with Fairfax's subtle urgency, suggesting that he knew more than he revealed, and that she had been placed in a position to interpret signals she barely understood. The maid's nervousness and the cook's attention to odd movements hinted at a secondary layer. Household members were aware, partially or wholly, of tensions that the scholar and nun embodied, and Lord Pendleton's concern, while ostensibly about propriety, masked the deeper fear that mismanagement or scandal could seep outward, tarnishing the estate's standing. By the late evening, Miss Marple had constructed a web of interconnected motives, a labyrinth in which greed, ambition, fear, and duty intertwined. No single theory explained the entirety of events, but the framework allowed her to anticipate where deception would manifest next. The crucifix was no longer merely a strange object. It was a signal, a pivot around which suspicion, intention, and reaction revolved. The letters were no longer just cryptic documents. They were keys to understanding the alignment of human impulses, subtle enough to mask the true aim yet precise in their design. Miss Marple realized that the next phase of the investigation would require careful testing of these motives, watching how each individual responded when presented with choice, pressure, and observation. Some would respond with honesty, some with strategic concealment, and others with calculated misdirection. The detective's role was to discern which reactions were genuine, which were constructed, and which, though hidden, carried the essential truth. The motive maze, as she thought of it, was intricate and nearly suffocating in its complexity. Yet every day, every observation, every conversation added clarity. The overlapping layers of greed, fear, and ambition created a pattern, and Miss Marple understood that while the web was tangled, it was not impenetrable. Patience, attention to detail, and careful observation of both words and gestures would illuminate the hidden forces that had orchestrated the events of the library. As she finally retired to her room for the night, Miss Marple allowed herself a small measure of satisfaction. The web of motives had been mapped, if not yet fully traversed. Each suspect's desires, fears, and ambitions now had a place in her understanding, and from this intricate lattice, the path to uncovering the truth would inevitably emerge. The motive maze was vast, complex, and fraught with misdirection, but for Miss Marple, it was a challenge to be navigated with quiet precision and patient intellect, one step at a time. The morning air in Pendleton Manor was crisp, carrying with it a sense of expectation that belied the quiet halls. Miss Marple had spent the previous night reflecting on the motive maze she had uncovered, tracing each thread of ambition, fear, and duty through the careful accounts of the household. By mid-morning, a sudden development drew the household together in the library once more. The local constable, who had grown increasingly confident in his grasp of events, entered breathless, holding a small package in his hands. "Miss Marple, Lord Pendleton," he began, voice taut with triumph. "We've found something remarkable in the garden. It appears someone dropped a notebook near the rose bushes behind the east wing. It contains notes in Mr. Fairfax's handwriting, and—" He paused for dramatic effect. "References to the crucifix and the letters we discovered." The household stirred with quiet murmurs of surprise. Lord Pendleton's eyes brightened with a mixture of relief and pride. "This is it, then. Proof of the scholar's interference. He must have planted the crucifix, orchestrated the letters, and sought to manipulate Sister Beatrice for his own gain." Miss Marple, seated calmly near the fireplace, allowed the excitement to wash over the room without rising. She examined the notebook, noting the neat, precise handwriting and the careful arrangement of notes. At first glance, it appeared damning. Fairfax had indeed written observations about the crucifix, the letters, and references to Sister Beatrice's responses. The constable, eager to close the case, immediately began detailing how Fairfax's access to the library and manuscripts made him the prime suspect. "Of course," Lord Pendleton said, turning to Miss Marple, "this confirms what I feared. The scholar's ambition led him to tamper with the items in the library. We can safely say the matter is resolved." Yet Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the notebook, her lips pressed into a thin line. Something did not align. While the evidence seemed incontrovertible, a subtle unease tugged at her intuition. The notes were almost too neatly written, too deliberate in their placement. The chronology appeared flawless, as though intended to convey a certain narrative to anyone who discovered them. She noted how the ink on the notebook's pages matched perfectly with Fairfax's usual writing instruments, yet the flow of the text felt rehearsed, a story constructed for an audience rather than a reflection of genuine intent. She gently touched the cover of the notebook. "It is remarkable indeed," she said aloud, though in a measured tone, "yet we must consider the possibility that appearances, no matter how compelling, can be deceptive. The notebook tells a story, but is it the story we are meant to see, or one deliberately constructed to mislead?" Her caution went largely unheeded. The constable began to prepare a report, and Lord Pendleton spoke to Fairfax, whose composure now wavered slightly under the weight of accusation. Fairfax protested, naturally, yet the evidence of his own handwriting seemed irrefutable. Sister Beatrice looked on with wide eyes, the faintest trace of fear etched across her otherwise serene face. The atmosphere thickened with the satisfaction of resolution, yet Miss Marple felt the tension in the room like a loose thread that, if tugged, would unravel the certainty others clung to. She requested a moment alone with the notebook, turning the pages slowly, observing the content in detail. While the majority of notes aligned with known events, she discovered subtle inconsistencies. Certain observations mentioned times when Fairfax could not possibly have been in the library, given the staff schedules and his own documented presence in other parts of the house. There were small errors in the alignment of ink, as if some pages had been written later than claimed. Even the references to Sister Beatrice's reactions, though accurate in tone, were phrased in a way that suggested prior knowledge rather than genuine observation. Miss Marple set the notebook aside and rose, moving to a vantage point near the window. She watched Fairfax step into the garden, ostensibly to retrieve another volume or continue his scholarly work. His movements were careful, measured, almost rehearsed. The tension in his shoulders and the precise control of his hands suggested awareness of observation, yet there was a deliberate avoidance of certain areas. The rose bushes, the morning-room window, and the path behind the east wing. The detective's intuition whispered that someone else had been at play, someone who could manipulate appearances while remaining unseen. Later, she spoke quietly to Sister Beatrice. "Do you recall, yesterday, when the crucifix first appeared on the desk?" The nun nodded, a slight frown knitting her brow. "Yes, I found it in the morning. I was certain no one else had entered the library overnight." "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "we have discovered this notebook, conveniently pointing suspicion toward Mr. Fairfax. Is it possible that someone sought to create the impression of wrongdoing, where none truly existed?" Sister Beatrice's eyes widened slightly, the realization settling on her features. I had not considered it, but if someone wished to mislead, then who could it be?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it, only the calm of recognition. "That is precisely the question, my dear. The real criminal often remains in the shadows, letting others appear culpable until the moment they choose to act." The afternoon brought more activity. Lord Pendleton, emboldened by what seemed like a breakthrough, began to question Fairfax directly, seeking confessions and explanations. The scholar maintained a cautious politeness, but Miss Marple observed the flickers of impatience in his expression. More importantly, she noticed the subtle way Fairfax's eyes darted toward the alcove near the library entrance, the small cabinet behind the curtains, and even toward the bookshelves Miss Marple herself had examined for hidden clues. There was awareness there, not of guilt in the criminal sense, but of someone being guided deliberately or inadvertently toward a conclusion that may not reflect reality. Miss Marple continued her quiet scrutiny, considering the possible architects of deception, who, besides Fairfax, had the knowledge, opportunity, and subtle skill to stage the crucifix, write the letters, and arrange the notebook. The nun, though sincere in many respects, might have been an unwitting participant, while staff could observe but not orchestrate with such precision. Her mind returned to Lord Pendleton, whose concern for reputation and propriety could be exploited to create pressure and misdirection. Yet none of these possibilities fully explained the flawless, almost theatrical construction of the notebook. The handwriting, the timing, the apparent chain of evidence. It suggested careful planning by someone fully aware of human tendencies, someone who understood how suspicion could be guided. By early evening, the local authorities, confident in their solved case, had begun drafting formal statements. Fairfax, though protesting his innocence, had been temporarily restricted to certain areas while investigations concluded. The household, relieved in part, began to return to routine, the library restored to order, the crucifix back in its place, the letters once more carefully secured. Yet Miss Marple remained unsettled, pacing slowly near the hearth, noting every shadow, every flicker of movement outside the windows. It was then that a small detail caught her eye. A faint smear of ink on the edge of the rosebush path, where the notebook had supposedly been found. The smudge was inconsistent with Fairfax's usual writing instruments. It was too irregular, too hurried. Her intuition confirmed what she had suspected all along. The apparent breakthrough was a staged deception. Someone had planted the notebook deliberately to create the illusion of guilt, a false victory meant to distract attention from the true orchestrator who had observed, manipulated, and waited patiently in the wings. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, considering who could wield such subtle control. Whoever it was had knowledge of Fairfax's habits, access to the library and garden, and an understanding of human psychology sufficient to stage the notebook convincingly. And most important, they had remained hidden, allowing others, scholar, nun, staff, even Lord Pendleton, to believe the case had been resolved. The detective's calm gaze swept across the room. The real criminal, she knew, was watching. Perhaps even now, beyond the manor walls or within the safe confines of the estate, the architect of this ruse was preparing the next move, confident that others would follow the misleading trail, while the true design remained concealed. Miss Marple understood that this was not merely a puzzle of objects or letters, but a battle of perception, patience, and understanding human nature. The false victory had lulled the household into a fragile sense of resolution, yet beneath it lay the quiet tension of a game still in motion. As the night deepened, Miss Marple settled into her chair, her keen eyes tracing the faint patterns of shadow and light across the room. The notebook, the crucifix, the letters, and the carefully arranged objects all pointed toward a larger plan. She allowed herself a small, private acknowledgement. The case was far from solved. Someone remained in the shadows, and the moment of revelation would come only when they chose to act. Until then, vigilance, patience, and a careful reading of subtle human signals would be her only guides. Miss Marple spent the following morning in quiet reflection, reviewing her notes by the soft glow of the early sun streaming through the tall library windows. The apparent breakthrough with Fairfax's notebook had unsettled her, but more than that, it had sharpened her attention to detail. She returned to the crucifix, the letters, the handkerchief, and the minor inconsistencies in witnesses' accounts, considering what had been overlooked. Then her gaze fell upon an innocuous item tucked behind a stack of old theological volumes. A faded pamphlet, its edges browned with age, discussing a dispute from decades prior over rare religious manuscripts. Her curiosity piqued, Miss Marple carefully extracted the pamphlet. It described a scholarly disagreement involving a certain Father Anselm, known in local circles for his strictness and sharp intellect, and a young academic named Charles Fairfax, an older relative, she realized, of the current Mr. Adrian Fairfax. The pamphlet recounted a bitter rivalry that had escalated to public censure when accusations of misappropriation of documents were levelled against the younger Fairfax. Though the dispute had been resolved quietly, the animosity remained in whispers and private correspondence. Miss Marple felt a thrill of recognition. The threads of the past, buried for years, were now weaving directly into the present. She recalled the subtle hesitations in Sister Beatrice's accounts, the careful observations in Fairfax's notebook, and the curious attention of the household staff. Each of these behaviours, previously puzzling, now hinted at the influence of history. Could the current scholar be attempting to settle an old family score? Or perhaps someone else was manipulating him to achieve the same effect, exploiting the grudges that had persisted across generations. The idea that the crime had roots in the past lent a new dimension to the investigation, suggesting that the events in the library were not isolated, but part of a continuum of ambition, secrecy, and rivalry. Miss Marple began questioning the household with renewed purpose, focusing on knowledge of the estate's history and its former occupants. The maid, initially hesitant, mentioned in passing that she had discovered old letters tucked in the library's hidden compartments, letters she had assumed irrelevant. When Miss Marple inquired further, the maid reluctantly admitted that some of these correspondences had referenced the older Fairfax and his disputes with Father Anselm, though she had never seen them as pertinent to current events. Sister Beatrice, meanwhile, seemed uneasy when Miss Marple casually mentioned the pamphlet. "I remember hearing stories of disagreements long ago, involving the church and scholars," the nun admitted softly. "Father Anselm was particularly meticulous. I was told the manuscripts were the source of much conflict. but I believed it all resolved." Her hands twisted in her lap, betraying a tension she had attempted to conceal. It became clear to Miss Marple that the nun had more than passing knowledge of these historical disputes. Perhaps the legacy of past rivalries had subtly guided her reactions to events, whether consciously or not. Even Mr. Fairfax, in his measured manner, revealed hints of connection when Miss Marple casually referenced the historical disputes. His composure wavered for the briefest moment, a flicker in his eyes that suggested personal knowledge of family history he had not fully disclosed. She noted the alignment of his hands, the minute tightening of his jaw, and the way he avoided discussing certain manuscripts, particularly those tied to the older Fairfax. The young scholar's movements and responses suggested not only a scholarly interest, but an inherited preoccupation, the echoes of a bygone rivalry now shaping his behaviour in the manor. Miss Marple turned her attention to Lord Pendleton. Though he remained outwardly concerned with propriety and the preservation of family honour, subtle cues hinted at his awareness of the estate's history. A faint tightening of his lips when old manuscripts were mentioned, the protective glance towards Sister Beatrice, and his eagerness to dismiss minor discrepancies all suggested a desire to shield both reputation and lives from the reverberations of historical grievances. The layers of intention and caution, once considered mundane, now seemed rooted in a careful navigation of past conflicts. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had begun to piece together an overlooked chain of events. The dispute between the older Fairfax and Father Anselm had created tensions that lingered in private correspondence, whispered stories, and subtle manipulations. Someone, whether a descendant, an accomplice, or a figure long silent, had likely orchestrated elements of the current confusion to exploit these tensions. The placement of the crucifix, the notes in the letters, and the notebook discovered in the garden could all be understood as instruments of influence, carefully designed to prompt reactions that mirrored historical rivalries. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on a small, overlooked detail, a tiny smudge of ink on the pamphlet she had discovered, aligning with a peculiar notation in Fairfax's notebook. The alignment was too precise to be coincidence. It suggested someone had intentionally left traces linking past and present, ensuring that the chain of influence would be interpreted in a specific manner. The interplay of old grudges with contemporary behaviour revealed the subtle genius of the orchestrator. By invoking history, they could manipulate perceptions, foster suspicion, and guide conclusions without direct interference. The detective's mind turned to the subtle dynamics of the household. Sister Beatrice's awareness, once considered minor, now appeared essential. She was both witness and participant, positioned perfectly to respond to cues left by someone with deep understanding of the manor's history. Fairfax's inherited awareness of family rivalries created the potential for manipulated behaviour, while the staff, peripheral yet observant, served as channels through which small hints could propagate. Lord Pendleton, too, was part of this intricate equation, his concern for propriety exploited as a lever to maintain the appearance of order, while events unfolded according to hidden design. Miss Marple realised that the crime was far more intricate than the authorities had considered. The notebook found in the garden, seemingly implicating Fairfax, was only a fragment of a larger strategy, a manoeuvre designed to exploit knowledge of the past and orchestrate present reactions. The true orchestrator remained unseen, yet the interplay of history and human behaviour now revealed both motive and method. The echoes of old conflicts had shaped the present, and the detective's task was to trace the reverberations back to their source. As evening fell over Pendleton Manor, the shadows of the past seemed to stretch long across the halls. Miss Marple carefully reviewed the connections she had unearthed. The pamphlet detailing the older Fairfax's disputes, the misaligned ink smudges, the subtle cues in Sister Beatrice's behaviour, and the reactions of Mr. Fairfax himself, all pointed toward a singular conclusion. The present mystery could not be fully understood without acknowledging its roots. Greed, ambition, and secrecy were not merely contemporary impulses. They were echoes of conflicts carefully embedded in the history of the manor and its occupants. Miss Marple allowed herself a small private acknowledgement of satisfaction. The hidden connection between suspects, now revealed through the lens of past grievances, had illuminated a path forward. The crime was not only about the present, the crucifix, the letters, and the notebook, but also about the long shadow cast by history, shaping human behaviour and guiding intention. Whoever had orchestrated the events in the library was playing a game informed by both contemporary desire and historical knowledge, and it would require all of Miss Marple's skill to uncover the final truth. By nightfall, the detective had mapped the emerging relationships and motivations with painstaking care. The shadows of the past, once invisible, now illuminated the connections between the household members, the scholar, and the artifacts of the manor. Miss Marple knew that the next phase of her investigation would exploit these connections, observing reactions to carefully framed questions and subtle provocations. The intricate weave of past and present, deception and observation was forming a clear pattern. She understood that the crime was no longer simply a matter of isolated acts. It was a tapestry, woven across generations, with the true perpetrator lurking patiently, waiting for the right moment to advance their design. Miss Marple had spent the night contemplating the shadows of the past and the tangled web of motives she had begun to untangle. By morning, she felt certain that the solution would not arise from mere questioning or routine observation. The case had evolved into a labyrinth where human nature itself was the key, and the ordinary methods employed by the authorities would only reinforce the illusion of resolution. She needed an unconventional approach, one that would bypass carefully constructed stories and reveal the subtle cracks in deception. As the household gathered in the library once more, Miss Marple quietly surveyed the familiar faces. Sister Beatrice sat poised, her hands folded neatly in her lap, radiating composure tinged with barely perceptible tension. Mr. Fairfax, the young scholar, appeared outwardly calm but with an underlying tightness in his shoulders, his eyes flicking from Miss Marple to the crucifix and then to the closed cabinet by the window. Lord Pendleton hovered near the fireplace, his brows knit as though weighing every word before it could escape his lips. Even the staff seemed keyed to a heightened awareness, sensing the shifting undercurrents of scrutiny. Miss Marple began without preamble. "I have been thinking," she said softly, drawing attention not to herself but to the objects scattered around the room. "Sometimes the mind reveals itself, not through direct questioning, but through subtle cues. Choices made when one believes they are unobserved, or reactions to information framed in a particular light." She paused, allowing her words to settle, then picked up a small silver ink pot from the desk. She placed it deliberately on the table, slightly askew, next to a neatly stacked set of letters. "I wonder," she continued, "if anyone among us would notice a discrepancy that seems trivial but might bear significance. It is fascinating, you see, how a mind preoccupied with concealment often attends to small details with far greater intensity than one who is innocent." Her approach was deliberate and understated, designed less to question than to provoke instinctive reactions. Miss Marple watched Fairfax carefully as she allowed her gaze to drift toward the crucifix lying nearby. She spoke again, almost casually. "I find it curious that certain items, the crucifix, the notebook, even this inkpot, appear to attract attention disproportionate to their apparent importance. It is as if someone expects another to respond, to betray some recognition." The young scholar shifted in his seat, just enough to catch Miss Marple's trained eye. There was a slight tightening of his jaw, a micro-expression of tension that belied his otherwise calm demeanour. Miss Marple made a mental note. The reaction was subtle, but in her experience such nuances often contained more truth than long-winded explanations. She continued, deliberately introducing a small ambiguity. "I have been examining these letters and notes again," she said, turning a page in Fairfax's notebook with a practised air. "It is remarkable how certain passages seem oddly aligned with the historical records of the older Fairfax and Father Anselm. One wonders if familiarity with past disputes could influence interpretation, or even behaviour." At the mention of the historical feud, Fairfax's hand twitched, brushing against the edge of the notebook as though to cover a thought he had not intended to reveal. He coughed lightly, a subtle stammer betraying a flicker of anxiety. Miss Marple observed, unflinching, noting the interplay between his conscious composure and the unconscious revelation of stress. She had expected the young scholar to respond politely, perhaps with a scholarly dismissal, yet his reaction suggested personal involvement, not merely academic interest. Next, Miss Marple employed a quiet psychological tactic. She retrieved the crucifix, holding it loosely in one hand while she casually rearranged the letters on the table. "I'm curious how objects of personal significance influence our responses," she remarked almost to herself. "Consider, for example, a symbol of faith or familial duty. It is remarkable how we unconsciously protect, manipulate, or respond to such items, even when under the gaze of others." She placed the crucifix deliberately in the path between Fairfax and the letters, arranging it so that he could not avoid observing it. Then she stepped back, adopting a neutral pose, and allowed silence to stretch. Fairfax's eyes flicked repeatedly between the letters, the notebook, and the crucifix. His movements became almost imperceptibly sharper, a quickened blink, a slight tightening of fists. Miss Marple sensed that the young scholar was struggling internally with knowledge he had been trying to contain. Meanwhile, the other occupants of the room reacted minimally, confirming that Fairfax's responses were personal rather than instinctive mimicry. Sister Beatrice's gaze remained calm, though her lips pressed together in a thin line. Lord Pendleton's concern was evident, yet he showed no micro-expressions of fear or guilt. The household staff seemed to note nothing unusual, leaving the young scholar isolated in his subtle display of tension. Miss Marple decided to push further, gently probing without accusation. "It is intriguing, is it not, how the past can echo in the present? One might think a scholar, aware of family history and historical disputes, could act with caution, or perhaps take advantage of knowledge that others assume is inaccessible." Fairfax's subtle physical reactions became more pronounced. A slight furrow of the brow, a tightening of the jaw, and a brief glance toward the hidden cabinet indicated a response she had anticipated. He was aware of something previously unseen, or perhaps he was concerned about what Miss Marple might reveal through careful observation of human behavior. The detective had created an environment in which his deception could no longer remain entirely hidden. Finally, she addressed the household as a group, without singling out any one person. "We are all influenced by what we believe others know and how we expect them to interpret our actions. Some items, some notes, some seemingly minor details can provoke responses that reveal far more than words ever could." She allowed a measured pause, observing the subtle interactions and the fleeting expressions, particularly Fairfax's. At that moment, Fairfax's composure faltered almost imperceptibly. He leaned forward, hands tightening around the edge of the desk, and for a split second Miss Marple saw the genuine reflection of concern, of anxiety, and perhaps of guilt. It was a crack in the carefully constructed facade, a microcosm of deception exposed by a quiet test, rather than direct interrogation. The unconventional tactic, manipulating objects, framing subtle psychological cues, and observing instinctive reactions, had succeeded where traditional questioning had failed. Miss Marple allowed the moment to linger, observing Fairfax's reaction to the crucifix, the letters, and the notebook, noting the pattern of avoidance, tension, and minute expressions. The evidence was not in what he said, but in how his body responded when confronted indirectly with information he believed was controlled. The young scholar's reaction revealed a truth his words would have denied, providing Miss Marple with a pivotal insight into the orchestrator's influence and the subtle manipulation of appearances. By evening, Miss Marple had mapped the psychological response with care. The unconventional method had revealed the faintest but most telling fracture in the veil of deception. Fairfax, though outwardly composed, could not fully conceal his recognition of the orchestrator's plan. Miss Marple understood now that the real criminal had anticipated human reactions and had used inherited tensions, historical knowledge, and well-placed objects to guide perception and suspicion. The unconventional clue was not a tangible item, but the reaction itself, a subtle, instinctive display that exposed the invisible threads connecting motive, opportunity, and manipulation. She retired to her quiet room later that night, reflecting on the success of her method. The case had deepened, evolving into a challenge of human observation and psychological acuity. With the knowledge revealed by Fairfax's response, Miss Marple could now begin to trace the true architect of events, observing the interplay of past grievances, present motives, and the calculated orchestration of objects and behaviours. The unconventional clue had pierced the carefully constructed illusion, and the shadows of deception began to yield to the patient and perceptive eye of the detective. The morning mist hung low over Pendleton Manor, curling around the hedgerows and slipping silently through the windows of the library, where Miss Marple was reviewing her notes. The previous day's psychological test had yielded subtle but decisive insight. Fairfax's micro-reactions had revealed the faintest cracks in his composure, a clue invisible to anyone untrained in the delicate reading of human behaviour. Miss Marple was poised to pursue that thread when an unexpected disruption shattered the fragile sense of order she had begun to cultivate. The library door opened abruptly, and the housekeeper, a usually composed woman named Mrs. Calvert, rushed in, her hands trembling slightly as she held a small tray. "Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, I don't understand. The letters. One of the crucial manuscripts. It's gone. I only just had them here on the desk a moment ago." Miss Marple's calm exterior did not falter, though her mind raced. She rose and followed Mrs. Calvert to the desk. Where the letters and the small codex of handwritten notes had been, now there was only a faint indentation in the dust, a subtle absence in an otherwise undisturbed room. The silver ink pot sat exactly where it had been, undisturbed, but the primary evidence, the materials linking historical grievances with present actions, had vanished. Lord Pendleton, who had been in the adjoining drawing-room, entered immediately upon hearing the news. His expression shifted from concern to sharp anger. "Vanished? Are you suggesting theft, Mrs. Calvert?" he demanded, though his tone carried the tremor of fear beneath the surface. "This is most irregular. Those documents are invaluable, not merely in monetary terms, but for the integrity of this household." Miss Marple approached the desk with deliberate care, examining the precise area where the documents had been placed. The absence itself spoke volumes. There was no evidence of forced entry, no sign of disturbance to the shelves, no smudge or fingerprint outside what would normally occur in daily handling. Whoever had removed the materials was careful, deliberate, and likely confident that they could manipulate the flow of information to their advantage. The detective's gaze shifted to the remaining objects. The crucifix, still lying where it had been tested against Fairfax's reaction, and the notebook discovered in the garden, now slightly askew. A subtle line of ink extended toward the edge of the desk, a micro-splatter that had gone unnoticed before. Miss Marple knelt, her keen eyes scanning the pattern. It suggested not casual handling, but a hurried removal, perhaps with gloves, with the intention of leaving no trace of direct involvement. "I imagine," Miss Marple said quietly, "that someone has intervened deliberately, seeking to hinder our progress. The removal of these letters is not an accident. It is a calculated attempt to redirect attention, to disrupt the investigation before more connections can be made." Sister Beatrice, standing nearby, paled slightly. "But who could do such a thing? And why?" Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and unwavering, met hers. "Someone who understands both the value of these materials and the significance of our observations. They wish to control what information is available, and perhaps to manipulate perception once more. The stakes are higher now. Whoever it is must be acting with considerable caution and foresight." The household staff, usually quiet in the face of such crises, whispered among themselves. Mrs. Calvert attempted to rationalize the disappearance. "Perhaps it was Mr. Fairfax," she ventured timidly. "He knows the contents well, and—" She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the young scholar who was now pacing the far side of the room. "Perhaps he took them to prevent misinterpretation." Miss Marple allowed the suggestion to hang in the air without comment. It was entirely possible that Fairfax was implicated, yet she could not ignore the subtler implications. Someone else, entirely hidden, might be manipulating the scholar, using his own instincts and inherited tendencies to draw suspicion while remaining unseen. The detective's mind raced, mapping the intricate layers of motive and opportunity now complicated by this vanishing evidence. Lord Pendleton, growing increasingly anxious, suggested immediate action. "We must search every room, every hidden compartment. The person responsible cannot have left the estate. None of us could have overlooked such an event unless—" His voice faltered, as he considered the implications, the thought of a calculated intruder operating within the household. Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "Patience, Lord Pendleton. The object itself has vanished, yes, but the traces it left behind, the positions of the remaining items, the smudges of ink, the responses of those present, remain. We must observe these indicators carefully. Haste may lead to misjudgment." She turned to Fairfax, who now looked unusually pale, hands clasped tightly behind his back. "Mr. Fairfax," she said, her voice calm but precise, "you were aware of these letters' significance yesterday. Tell me, did you notice anyone acting strangely as you left the library this morning?" The scholar's brow furrowed. I did not. I returned from the morning room with my notes, and nothing seemed amiss. The letters were exactly where they should have been." He hesitated, an instinctive twitch betraying the lie he did not intend. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the movement instantly, a subtle flick of the hand, a slight shift in posture. Something was amiss, though not directly his fault. He was reacting to the orchestrator's influence, unconsciously aware that someone else had acted in deliberate secrecy. Miss Marple moved through the library methodically, examining each corner, each compartment, each familiar hiding spot for the missing items. It became clear that the intruder had intimate knowledge of the manor, where the letters were kept, which areas were least monitored, and which objects could be left to suggest the illusion of innocence. Whoever had done this had not only removed evidence, but had done so in a manner that manipulated observation, creating a narrative of confusion to misdirect even the most careful detective. As she paused by the window overlooking the rose garden, Miss Marple noticed a faint disturbance in the soil. A footprint, partial and obscured, barely distinguishable against the early morning dew. It was not enough to identify the individual directly, but it confirmed that someone had moved swiftly, deliberately, and with awareness of surveillance. The footprint aligned with her earlier observations, careful, calculated, and designed to remain elusive. Sister Beatrice approached, voice trembling slightly. "Miss Marple, do you believe the person will take more? Will they try to interfere again?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, my dear. The disappearance of these letters is a warning. The orchestrator wishes to control the pace and direction of discovery. But while the evidence may vanish, the human responses, the micro-expressions, the subtle hesitations, the knowledge revealed through behavior, cannot be removed. That is where we will find the truth." Lord Pendleton's anxiety escalated visibly. "We must secure the estate, seal off all access." Miss Marple placed a calming hand on his arm. "Security measures alone will not suffice. The individual responsible is patient and cunning. They have observed us carefully and are aware of our methods. We must remain equally observant, using perception and understanding as our primary tools." The day progressed with heightened scrutiny. Staff movements were monitored, Fairfax's behaviour observed, and Sister Beatrice subtly questioned about minor recollections. Yet despite all, the vanished letters remained missing, a tangible reminder that the case was far from resolved. Trust, already fragile, became even more tenuous as each member of the household wondered who might be capable of such an act, and whether anyone within their midst was working for the unseen orchestrator. By evening, Miss Marple had reconstructed a preliminary map of opportunity and influence, tracing the likely path of the intruder and noting which individuals had been placed in positions to witness, misinterpret, or unknowingly propagate the deception. The vanishing evidence had raised the stakes, proving that the game was no longer about mere observation or deduction. It was about anticipating the moves of an adversary who was both patient and strategic. Sitting quietly in her favourite chair, Miss Marple considered the implications. The disappearance was not a setback, but an escalation, a deliberate act to test both the household's vigilance and her own. The orchestrator's boldness revealed confidence, perhaps overconfidence, and Miss Marple knew that this would eventually provide a key advantage. The detective's task now was to read the shadows, track the invisible currents of manipulation, and ensure that the vanishing evidence did not obscure the truth but rather guided her toward it. She allowed herself a small, private acknowledgement. The missing letters were not the end. They were the signal that the game had intensified. Someone was working to bury the truth before it could emerge, but Miss Marple understood with quiet certainty that careful observation, patient deduction, and an understanding of human behavior would ultimately reveal the orchestrator lurking in the shadows. The fragile web of trust, though tested, would guide her to the truth, even if the evidence itself had temporarily disappeared. The next morning dawned over Pendleton Manor with an unusual quiet, the sort that presses against the senses, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple had been awake before sunrise, reviewing the evolving threads of deception and the vanished letters, careful to trace every nuance she had observed in Fairfax, Sister Beatrice, and the household staff. The previous day's events, the unconventional psychological test, and the disappearance of the evidence had only sharpened her awareness. She sensed that the orchestrator of these events was not merely hiding. They were planning, patient and deliberate, always a step ahead. Miss Marple had barely made her way to the library for her morning assessment when a sharp, urgent knocking echoed through the hall. It was unusual for any visitor to arrive unannounced, particularly at this early hour. Lord Pendleton, who had taken to pacing the corridors with increasing anxiety, opened the door, revealing the constable, dishevelled and visibly shaken. "Miss Marple, Lord Pendleton!" the man exclaimed, almost tripping over the threshold. There's been an incident in the East Wing." The detective followed, swiftly, her cane clicking against the polished floor, moving with the precision of someone whose mind was already mapping possibilities. In the East Wing, the scene was chaos masked under a veneer of control. The small study adjacent to Fairfax's quarters had been ransacked, papers scattered, books torn from their shelves, and a faint metallic scent lingering in the air. Yet the most alarming detail was the absence of Sister Beatrice. The nun, who had been meticulously attending to the library and manuscripts, was nowhere to be found. Lord Pendleton's face drained of colour. "Disappeared? You mean taken?" The constable shook his head, clearly overwhelmed. "I don't know. I found the study in this state, Miss Marple. No one saw or heard anything. It's as if she vanished into thin air." Miss Marple's mind raced, noting the pattern. The first disruption, the vanishing letters, had been a test, a warning, a manipulation of perception. Now a person had vanished. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer a mere puzzle of observation. It was a dangerous, evolving threat. The orchestrator was bold enough to act directly, and the disappearance of Sister Beatrice suggested both foresight and confidence in evading detection. She moved through the study with careful attention. Every detail, every anomaly was a potential clue. A chair was slightly turned, as if someone had hastily exited. A window latch was intact, though faint scuff marks on the sill suggested that someone had leaned there. A half-open drawer revealed nothing of consequence, yet the angle and placement implied deliberate staging, as if the room itself were a message intended for observers. Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small, nearly invisible thread of gold embroidery snagged on the corner of a drawer, matching the edge of Sister Beatrice's habit. "This is no random act," Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself. "The orchestrator has calculated every step, predicting our observations, manipulating our assumptions, and now using a person as leverage or bait." Lord Pendleton's worry deepened. But why? What could they hope to achieve by taking Sister Beatrice? Surely her disappearance will draw attention and force the household into panic. His voice faltered. "Unless that is exactly the point." Miss Marple nodded grimly. "Precisely. The removal of the letters was to test reactions, to mislead us. The disappearance of Sister Beatrice is to escalate tension, provoke mistakes, and perhaps even to mask the next stage of the plan. Whoever is responsible wishes to remain several steps ahead, and they are using human impulses, fear, anxiety, and our desire for resolution to manipulate the course of events." She turned her gaze to Fairfax, who had arrived shortly after the initial discovery, pale but composed. His hands fidgeted at the edge of his coat. "Mr. Fairfax," she began, voice measured yet firm, "you have knowledge of the library, the documents, and the household routines. Tell me honestly, did you see or hear anything unusual last night?" The scholar's response was careful, measured, but there was tension in his posture, a subtle shift in weight that betrayed instinctive unease. I "I cannot say that I did," he said. "I was occupied with my studies, and I did not notice anyone approaching the study." Miss Marple observed him keenly. The micro-expressions, the tightening of the jaw, the brief flicker of the eyes toward the window suggested that he was not entirely unaware of developments. Whether he was merely cautious or complicit remained uncertain, but Miss Marple recognized that the orchestrator had taken advantage of Fairfax's preoccupation with family history, scholarly diligence, and inherited tendencies, guiding him unwittingly into a web of suspicion while remaining hidden. Turning her attention outward, Miss Marple directed a careful survey of the grounds. The east wing overlooked the private garden, a labyrinth of hedges and paths that could conceal movement. There were faint signs of disturbance, a small branch broken at waist height, slight depressions in the soft soil, and the faintest traces of shoe prints partially washed by morning dew. Nothing definitive, yet the subtle markers hinted at a deliberate exit, as if the orchestrator knew precisely where to leave traces without revealing identity. Miss Marple decided to employ another careful psychological tactic. She addressed the household gathered in the hallway, avoiding direct accusation, but framing her words to provoke instinctive reactions. "It is remarkable," she said, "how swiftly some individuals can act under pressure, and how others can remain calm while observing. One's attention to detail, even in mundane matters, may reveal far more than deliberate statements. The loss of letters, the disappearance of a person, these are not random events. They are signals, intended to test our vigilance and guide our interpretations." As she spoke, Fairfax shifted again, almost imperceptibly. His hands tightened at his sides, and his gaze flitted briefly toward the alcove where the missing letters had been stored. The micro-reaction confirmed her suspicions. He was aware of elements beyond his immediate knowledge, perhaps cognizant of the orchestrator's influence and the potential danger now posed to Sister Beatrice. Miss Marple then focused on the staff, whose expressions were revealing in subtler ways. Mrs. Calvert's worry was genuine, but she too displayed minor inconsistencies, a fleeting glance toward a rarely accessed storage room, a hesitated step near the east wing corridor. These small reactions suggested awareness, yet not necessarily culpability. The detective understood that the orchestrator's control extended beyond a single individual, manipulating perception to create confusion, doubt, and fear. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had begun mapping likely scenarios. Sister Beatrice's disappearance was no impulsive act. The orchestrator had foreseen the household's routines, timed their movements to exploit gaps in supervision, and carefully calculated the path of extraction. The vanishing evidence of the previous day had been a preliminary test. This disappearance was escalation. The detective realized that time was now a critical factor, not merely to solve the prior mysteries, but to prevent further harm. Whoever orchestrated these events was not content with manipulation alone. They were willing to endanger life to maintain control. Miss Marple considered the possibilities. The orchestrator could be operating from within the household, using subtle influence to manipulate Fairfax and others, or they could be external, exploiting knowledge of the estate's routines and historical tensions to act with precision. The critical factor, however, was clear. Sister Beatrice's location and safety depended on swift understanding of both motive and method. Observing human reactions, interpreting micro-expressions, and tracing the sequence of prior manipulations would be key to preventing further tragedy. The detective sat quietly for a moment, her mind weaving together the threads of disappearance, vanished letters, and manipulated behavior. The case had transformed from a study of observation and deduction to a race against time, with human lives hanging in the balance. The orchestrator remained several steps ahead, but every micro-reaction, every subtle inconsistency, and every trace of past and present deception provided Miss Marple with a pathway to follow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manor grounds, Miss Marple rose with a determined air. The unexpected twist had intensified the investigation, forcing her to not only solve a complex mystery but also anticipate the orchestrator's next move. Patience, observation, and a careful reading of human nature would now serve not merely to reveal guilt, but to protect life itself. The The detective understood the stakes had never been higher, and the next actions would require the sharpest insight yet. Miss Marple returned to the library late that evening, the quiet hum of the Manor's night settling around her like a soft curtain. The disappearance of Sister Beatrice and the vanishing letters had cast a shadow of unease over Pendleton Manor, yet the detective knew that beneath the chaos there was an order waiting to be discerned. She had spent hours retracing steps, reviewing observations, and considering every micro-expression, every hesitation, and every unusual behaviour she had noted over the past days. And now, amidst the seeming disorder, she began to detect the faintest glimmer of a pattern. It was in something almost laughably mundane at first, a small, irregularly placed object on the desk where Fairfax had been studying. A silver paper knife, slightly bent at the tip, rested near the ink pot. Ordinarily, this would be dismissed as trivial, but Miss Marple remembered the peculiar alignment of items during her psychological test. The notebook, the crucifix, and the letters had all been deliberately positioned to evoke subtle reactions. She picked up the paper knife and held it under the light. It bore a tiny scratch along the edge, almost imperceptible, yet in the context of her earlier observations, it seemed intentional rather than accidental. Her thoughts drifted back to the day of the first test, when Fairfax had reacted to the crucifix and the letters with micro-expressions betraying internal conflict. Then came the vanishing letters, a deliberate act to test, mislead, and manipulate. Finally, Sister Beatrice's disappearance, executed with precision. Each event had seemed chaotic, disconnected, yet now Miss Marple saw a continuity. All were designed to probe reactions, to manipulate assumptions, and to guide attention away from the orchestrator. The bent paper knife was another subtle signal, a physical echo of the same methodical approach. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, recalling conversations and minor inconsistencies that had previously seemed inconsequential. The housekeeper's hesitated glance toward the east wing corridor, Fairfax's subtle gestures when historical disputes were mentioned, and Sister Beatrice's own slight tremor when the pamphlet detailing the old grievances had been referenced. All these behaviours suddenly coalesced into a discernible rhythm. The orchestrator had been working not through force or threat, but through the careful, calculated manipulation of human behaviour, using history, instinct, and perception as tools. She stood and moved to the window overlooking the garden. The slight depressions in the soil from the previous day, the branch broken at waist height, the partial footprint, each was a piece of a larger map. Miss Marple traced the route in her mind, noting the alignment with the east wing, the private study, and the library. The orchestrator had left not only physical traces, but also behavioural markers, designed to lead observers down a path that seemed logical, yet obscured the true objective. Then it struck her, the seemingly trivial comment Fairfax had made about the older manuscripts. He had mentioned almost in passing that certain documents were best understood when viewed together, not individually. At the time, Miss Marple had noted it politely, filing it away as scholarly musing. But now, in the context of all the manipulations, it became significant. The orchestrator had counted on these small remarks, these almost unnoticed statements, to shape perceptions, to mislead, and to signal without overtly revealing their intentions. Miss Marple retrieved Fairfax's notebook from the garden, careful to examine its pages anew. A pattern in the annotations emerged, every page marked with slight underlining, every marginal note, and even the positions of letters seemed to correspond to the movements of people, objects, and attention across the manor. The orchestrator's design was subtle, elegant, and almost imperceptible, not through direct communication, but through the orchestration of events, cues, and reactions that led observers to misinterpret or overlook the true connections. She reflected on Sister Beatrice's disappearance. The nun's absence had seemed abrupt, random, yet the sequence of events suggested deliberate timing. Someone had calculated the household's routines, knowing exactly when the study would be unobserved, how Fairfax would respond to items left strategically, and how the staff would react. Even the timing of the morning mist and the soft light falling across the east wing seemed to have been anticipated, providing the perfect cover for movement. Miss Marple's mind pieced together these threads with the satisfaction of recognizing a pattern previously hidden by the apparent chaos. Lord Pendleton entered the library quietly, having observed Miss Marple at work. "Have you discovered something, Miss Marple?" he asked, a mix of hope and apprehension in his voice. "Yes, Lord Pendleton," she replied calmly, though her eyes sparkled with the thrill of clarity. "It appears that the orchestrator's method has been consistent all along. Each disruption, the vanished letters, Sister Beatrice's disappearance, even the seemingly insignificant scratches and placements, has been part of a deliberate plan to manipulate perception and guide conclusions. The key to understanding the case has not been hidden in new evidence, but in plain sight, in the subtle interactions, small remarks, and minor anomalies we have already observed." Fairfax, who had been standing near the corner of the room, shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple's attention turned to him, noting the slight blanching of his complexion and the tightening of his fingers. He seemed to sense that the detective had deciphered the rhythm of events, that she had seen the invisible threads connecting motive, opportunity, and manipulation. "The orchestrator has relied on human nature," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but firm, "on our tendencies to misinterpret, overlook, or assume patterns where none exist. Yet every individual's response, every micro-expression, every gesture has contributed to a larger design, one that can now be traced, understood, and ultimately unravelled." She paused, letting the weight of her observation sink in. The pattern was no longer obscured by chaos. It revealed a map of intention, a sequence of calculated moves that, when viewed collectively, pointed directly to the orchestrator's strategy. Even Fairfax's own inadvertent reactions were part of this map, echoes of the manipulations layered upon inherited knowledge and scholarly preoccupations. Miss Marple then outlined the next steps in her mind: careful observation of remaining behavioural cues, tracing the movements and influence of all household members, and reconstructing the orchestrator's likely next actions. The pattern had emerged, and with it, the ability to anticipate, rather than merely react. The vanishing letters were no longer a loss. They were part of a larger design whose logic could now be followed. Sister Beatrice's absence was not merely a threat, it was a clue embedded in timing, space, and human response. By late evening, as the manor settled into the muted quiet of night, Miss Marple felt a sense of cautious satisfaction. The chaos, the disappearances, the subtle manipulations, all had coalesced into a discernible pattern. The key to the case, she realized, had been there all along, embedded in the ordinary and overlooked. A bent paper knife, a micro-expression, an offhand remark, an unusual alignment of objects. The orchestrator had relied on invisibility of perception, but in their meticulous design they had left traces. Traces only someone patient, observant, and attuned to human nature could discern. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. The path forward was no longer shrouded in uncertainty. With the pattern revealed, she could anticipate the next move, safeguard the vulnerable, and begin drawing the orchestrator into the open. What had once seemed a series of random, perplexing incidents was now a structured game of human psychology and precise orchestration. And with careful observation, insight, and patience, the final threads of the mystery could soon be unravelled. Miss Marple spent the early hours of the following morning reviewing her notes, the evidence, and the subtle observations she had compiled over the past days. The manor, cloaked in the quiet hush of dawn, seemed almost complicit in the unfolding drama. The pattern she had discerned, micro-expressions, the subtle placement of objects, the sequence of disappearances and misdirections, was clear now. Yet she sensed that beneath even this intricate web lay an even deeper truth, one not about mere opportunity or impulse, but about a concealed motive so personal and consuming that it had shaped every action with precision and audacity. Her first course was to revisit Fairfax. The young scholar had been under intense observation ever since the disappearance of Sister Beatrice. His reactions to Miss Marple's unconventional clues had revealed more than he realized: anxiety, fleeting guilt, tension, instinctive defensiveness. Yet, nothing about him suggested the deliberate cruelty or strategic manipulation that had orchestrated the vanishing letters and the abduction. Fairfax, though imperfect, was a tool, a pawn whose tendencies and inherited knowledge had been exploited, but he was not the architect. Miss Marple quietly observed Lord Pendleton as he moved through the morning halls, attempting to restore some semblance of order. He was a man of intellect and meticulous habits, yet each measured step seemed weighed down by unease. His eyes lingered too long on certain corridors, revisiting rooms as though ensuring no anomaly had been overlooked. His concern for Sister Beatrice was genuine, but Miss Marple's trained eye noted the subtle overtones in his behaviour, a protective instinct intertwined with anxiety not entirely attributable to moral concern. Something about his preoccupation seemed to extend beyond the present crisis, rooted in a memory or fear that had not yet surfaced. Then, an overlooked detail from earlier in the investigation resurfaced. While examining the library, Miss Marple had noted a small, nearly imperceptible engraving on the back of an antique mirror, the initials E.C. When first encountered, she had attributed it to a previous occupant, perhaps an inconsequential marking of ownership. Yet in the context of recent events, it suddenly assumed new significance. She recalled the old correspondence she had seen tucked in Fairfax's notebook, the letters referencing an extended family feud, disputes over inheritance and grievances from decades past. And in one document, scarcely legible and almost dismissed at the time, there was mention of a clandestine personal diary belonging to a family member known only as Eleanor Calder. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the connections. Eleanor Calder had been Lord Pendleton's maternal aunt, a woman known in family history for her obsession with reputation, legacy, and what she considered justice for slights against her branch of the family. She had left behind writings detailing perceived betrayals, subtle instructions for manipulating those around her, and even guidance for orchestrating events to ensure her ideals prevailed after her death. It became evident that the entire series of incidents, the vanishing letters, Fairfax's manipulated reactions, the disappearance of Sister Beatrice, were an extension of Eleanor Calder's influence, meticulously encoded into the household's routines and the familial psyche. The revelation was staggering. The crime was not merely about tangible gain. It was about legacy, about enforcing an invisible moral code and punishing perceived transgressions against family honour. The orchestrator had embedded themselves so deeply within the fabric of Pendleton Manor's daily life that each act of misdirection was a calculated step toward exposing human frailty and reaffirming an idealized vision of justice. This psychological underpinning explained the meticulous attention to detail, the orchestration of behavioral cues, and the patient manipulation of multiple individuals simultaneously. Miss Marple now understood Fairfax's role more clearly. His scholarly tendencies, obsession with historical accuracy, and sensitivity to familial dynamics had made him the perfect instrument to draw out reactions, provoke misinterpretation, and act as an unwitting intermediary. Sister Beatrice's disappearance was equally purposeful. She represented moral rectitude, observant presence, and the potential to disrupt the orchestrator's subtle manipulations. By removing her temporarily, the villain ensured that the household would unravel along predictable psychological lines, allowing hidden motives to surface and human weaknesses to be exposed. Turning her attention to Lord Pendleton, Miss Marple noted the subtle signs of recognition in his expressions as she silently considered Eleanor Calder's influence. His anxiety and protective behaviour were not solely about the present danger. They were deeply entwined with inherited guilt, fear of family dishonour, and the knowledge that the orchestrator's manipulations mirrored the very methods outlined in the aunt's writings. The villain, though perhaps no longer living in a conventional sense, had left a blueprint for psychological control so detailed that it functioned as an extension of their will, bending perception, behaviour, and fear to their design. Miss Marple decided it was time to confirm her theory. She requested that Lord Pendleton join her in the library, ensuring the household staff remained discreetly nearby but not intrusive. She began to speak gently, framing her deductions not as accusation but as understanding. "Lord Pendleton, have you ever considered that some influences, though long absent, may continue to shape events through their careful design and foresight?" He looked at her, tension evident in every line of his face. You mean Eleanor Calder," he whispered, a tremor betraying both fear and awe. I thought her influence ended decades ago. I had no idea her instructions could still guide people, even indirectly." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. The recent events, the disappearance, the letters, the manipulations of behaviour, follow the patterns she meticulously outlined in her writings. Every act, every subtle cue, every reaction has been anticipated. Her aim was not merely to control the household, but to enforce a moral and psychological order, punishing perceived weaknesses and rewarding vigilance in understanding human nature." The realization hit Lord Pendleton like a thunderclap. All this time, the fear, the confusion, it was her design. It wasn't about money or inheritance or even immediate revenge. It was her vision, her obsession with morality and influence, executed long after she was gone. His hands shook slightly as he absorbed the scope of this revelation. Miss Marple's voice softened, yet remained precise. "Exactly. The orchestrator's reach, though originating in the past, dictated the present. Fairfax, Sister Beatrice, the vanished letters, they were all instruments used to expose, test, and manipulate. The crimes, the manipulations, the misdirections, they are not mere happenstance. They are the psychological signature of Eleanor Calder, applied with care, patience, and unwavering intent." The shock of understanding shifted the dynamics of the investigation. What had once seemed like random chaos, petty deceit, or individual malice was now illuminated as a deeply rooted psychological campaign, constructed with the patience and foresight of someone intent on proving an ideology beyond mere life or death. Miss Marple reflected on the genius and peril of such manipulation. It was both elegant and terrifying, a crime of intellect and psychology rather than brute force. With this revelation, the detective could now approach the case differently. The motive, once hidden beneath layers of misdirection, was no longer abstract. The danger to Sister Beatrice and the ongoing manipulations were predictable within the framework of Eleanor Calder's design. By understanding the orchestrator's psychological blueprint, Miss Marple could anticipate further actions, safeguard the vulnerable, and guide the investigation toward resolution. Miss Marple leaned back, her hands folded in thought. The villain's psychology had been revealed, a need for control, for moral and familial justice, and for the exhibition of human weakness under precise manipulative circumstances. It was not about money, nor power, nor personal revenge in the conventional sense. It was about legacy, influence, and the obsessive perfection of a moral code left behind to shape the living. Understanding this motive illuminated the path forward and clarified why the orchestrator had been willing to go to such extremes. The manor, once a place of serene routine, was now recognized as a stage upon which past and present collided, driven by an extraordinary mind's unseen hand. The crime, though intricate and layered, had its heart in a psychological imperative: to observe, manipulate, and enforce a legacy of influence. And with the hidden motive revealed, Miss Marple could finally navigate the final threads of deception with clarity, insight, and a patient determination to restore both truth and safety to Pendleton Manor. Miss Marple had spent the entire morning in quiet preparation. The revelation of Eleanor Calder's orchestrated manipulations had shifted the investigation from deduction to anticipation. Every movement, every glance, every minor inconsistency now held a purpose, and the detective understood that the time had come to confront the orchestrator's living proxy, the individual who had executed Calder's plans within Pendleton Manor. The manor was unusually silent that afternoon, the staff hovering in restrained tension, each person aware that the past days had escalated beyond simple observation. Sister Beatrice had been safely returned to her quarters under Miss Marple's careful guidance, but the shadow of danger still lingered. The missing letters, now accounted for through careful retrieval, lay on the library table, a physical representation of the knowledge and history that had been manipulated to such dramatic effect. Miss Marple gathered Lord Pendleton, Fairfax, and the key household staff in the main drawing-room, presenting an air of calm authority. "We have observed, waited, and understood," she began, her tone composed but unwavering. "We now know the orchestrator's design, and we know their methods. The time has come to test the final step, to see whether the manipulations can endure the scrutiny of awareness." She produced a small, elegant mirror, one similar to the one marked with the initials EC, and placed it on the table, angled deliberately so that it reflected both the doorway and the main seating area. Every person in the room could see their own reflection, but more importantly, the mirror provided a view of anyone attempting to enter unnoticed or manipulate events from the periphery. Miss Marple's strategy was subtle, psychological, relying on perception as much as action. Fairfax, seated uneasily, glanced toward the mirror. "I do not understand." "Why this mirror?" he asked, his voice tight. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is not the mirror itself, but what it represents. It allows those who act with hidden intent to reveal themselves. Behavior cannot remain completely masked when one believes they may be observed." The household remained quiet, tension thick in the air. Hours of prior observation had prepared Miss Marple for this moment. The subtle alignment of reactions, the micro-expressions, the unconscious signals that would betray intent. She watched, calm and deliberate, as each person shifted in response to her words. Some fidgeted, some averted their gaze, and some remained unnervingly still. Then she noted it, the smallest of movements. The housekeeper, Mrs. Calvert, had taken a step closer to the door, eyes fixed on the reflection in the mirror, her fingers twitching slightly as if anticipating unseen instructions. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. The orchestrator, she realized, was relying not on brute force or overt actions, but on the manipulation of others, the subtle pressure applied through expectation, fear, and habit. "Mrs. Calvert," Miss Marple said softly, almost conversationally, "I understand now that the disturbances, the vanishing letters, and even Sister Beatrice's disappearance were not random. You executed these acts under guidance, interpreting instructions from someone you respected, someone whose presence lingered even after their death." Mrs. Calvert's breath caught. Her lips trembled and she opened her mouth, but no words came. Her eyes darted toward Fairfax, then toward Lord Pendleton, seeking validation or escape, but finding none. Miss Marple remained composed, letting the tension build, her patience like a taut string. "It is natural," Miss Marple continued, her tone unhurried, "to follow a path laid before you by someone whose influence you trust. But influence can become manipulation when it endangers others. The question now is whether conscience will prevail when the orchestration is revealed." Finally, Mrs. Calvert spoke, her voice barely audible. It was the letters, the instructions. She, Eleanor Calder, she knew everything. She left directions, plans, guidance. I only followed what I was told. I never meant for anyone to be harmed." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "And yet, the disappearance of Sister Beatrice demonstrates that even careful planning can have consequences unforeseen. Actions taken under influence carry weight, especially when human lives are at stake." Mrs. Calvert's shoulders slumped, the tension leaking from her frame. Her eyes, wide and fearful, now showed the dawning comprehension of accountability. I did not know how far. I did not think it would escalate like this," she admitted. Miss Marple allowed a brief pause, giving the confession space to settle, then turned her attention to Lord Pendleton. "You see now, my lord, that the true danger was not simply in the letters or in the disappearance, but in the unseen orchestration of human behavior. Every small action, every subtle manipulation was designed to test and expose. The orchestrator, Eleanor Calder, may have been gone, but her designs were executed through those she had influenced most directly." Lord Pendleton's face reflected a mixture of relief and shock. "I had suspected that someone had been guiding events, but I could not fathom the extent. My family's history, the grudges, the letters, the instructions, they were more potent than I imagined." Miss Marple's gaze shifted back to Mrs. Calvert, who now appeared drained of composure, every gesture betraying the release of a long-held, fraught secret. "The final step," Miss Marple said, "is understanding that influence is not immunity. Actions taken under direction must still be reconciled with conscience. You have admitted the truth, and in doing so, you have allowed the web of manipulation to collapse under its own weight. The orchestrator may have anticipated many outcomes, but human acknowledgement of responsibility remains unpredictable and powerful." The tension in the room eased, though the memory of fear lingered in the corners. Miss Marple, satisfied that the confession had been elicited without coercion or threat, quietly reflected on the elegance of psychological resolution. The mirror, the strategic observation, and the patient, deliberate framing of conversation had revealed the final link, the human executor of Calder's intricate plan. The chaos, the vanishing letters, and the disappearance of Sister Beatrice had all been steps in a meticulously designed sequence, yet each was ultimately traceable and interpretable through careful observation, insight, and understanding of human nature. Fairfax, still uneasy, spoke at last. "Miss Marple, so it was all instructions, all guided by some long-dead relative? It seems almost unbelievable." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with clarity. "The incredible is often hidden in the mundane. What appears as chaos is frequently order misread. What appears as misfortune may be intention unseen. Our task was to trace the invisible threads, to anticipate behaviour, and to reveal the truth hidden in plain sight. And that, Mr. Fairfax, is precisely what has occurred." The final act of confrontation left the household both shaken and enlightened. Miss Marple had maintained composure throughout, observing, anticipating, and guiding the revelation to a point where truth could no longer remain concealed. Mrs. Calvert's confession exposed the human executor of the orchestrator's design, and with it, the intricate psychological machinery that had governed the events of the past days was laid bare. As the sun set beyond the rolling hills surrounding Pendleton Manor, casting long, golden shadows across the estate, Miss Marple reflected on the culmination of her patient investigation. The villain's design, both historical and immediate, had been uncovered, the living executor confronted, and the cycle of manipulation interrupted. The manor would never be entirely free from its history, but understanding, clarity, and responsibility had been restored, and with them the delicate balance between past influence and present conscience. The calm that settled over Pendleton Manor after Mrs. Calvert's confession was fragile, a quiet interlude rather than a resolution. Miss Marple had anticipated the tension that followed the revelation of Eleanor Calder's influence, but even she could not entirely predict the final twist that would test her understanding to its limits. As the household slowly began to resume its routines, a new unease crept into the edges of perception, small, almost imperceptible, yet insistent, like the faintest echo in a cavern. Miss Marple was reviewing the recovered letters once more, examining the delicate handwriting, marginalia, and historical references, when a sudden knock at the library door drew her attention. Lord Pendleton, who had been pacing quietly, frowned. "At this hour?" he murmured, moving to open the door. A young maid, trembling slightly, entered and handed him a folded note. Her eyes were wide, uncertain, and Miss Marple's sharp gaze immediately detected the underlying fear in her expression. Lord Pendleton unfolded the note and read silently, his complexion draining as his hands shook. Miss Marple noted the precise way he held the paper, careful yet tense, as if the message contained a threat beyond comprehension. "Miss Marple," he said finally, voice tight, This is from Sister Beatrice." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Sister Beatrice had been secured under careful supervision. Her disappearance had been resolved days ago. "Read it aloud, if you would, my lord," she said, her tone calm, masking the sudden tension that prickled at her intuition. Lord Pendleton's voice trembled slightly as he read. "The letters, the mirror, the instructions, they are not complete. Someone has orchestrated a deeper design, one that even Eleanor Calder did not foresee. Watch closely, for the final act is still in motion." The room seemed to chill instantly, the air heavy with implication. Miss Marple's mind raced, retracing every step of the investigation. Every disruption, every micro-expression, every subtle behavioural cue had been accounted for. Yet this note implied a layer beyond even her comprehensive mapping. Someone else, she realised, had been working behind the scenes, manipulating the manipulators themselves. "Who could have known the details of Eleanor Calder's instructions so thoroughly?" she murmured, her eyes scanning the assembled household. Fairfax shifted uncomfortably, and even Lord Pendleton's composed facade faltered. The orchestrator's proxy is no longer just the executor of historical instructions. There is an independent mind at work, using what was left behind to achieve another purpose entirely. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to subtle discrepancies she had observed over the past days. Fairfax's fleeting glances toward the library desk, the minor hesitations in Lord Pendleton's recounting of movements, and even Sister Beatrice's own nervous demeanour when returning to her quarters. All had seemed explainable at the time. Now, in retrospect, they hinted at another layer. Someone within the manor had been monitoring not only events but the investigators themselves, ensuring that the narrative unfolded in a controlled manner, maintaining suspense and subtly directing attention away from the true mastermind. She paced slowly, deliberately, considering the possibilities. The last-minute twist had to involve someone with intimate knowledge of the household, someone who had access to both the letters and the psychological manipulations designed by Calder. The fact that Sister Beatrice's note arrived now suggested that the new orchestrator wanted to remain invisible, letting the tension build while guiding perception toward false certainty. Her eyes fell upon Fairfax. There was nothing overtly incriminating, yet his posture, his reactions, the careful way he had retrieved and handled documents, all pointed to a mind capable of subtle duplicity. Yet Miss Marple hesitated. The scholar had been manipulated himself carefully by Calder's instructions and Mrs. Calvert's execution. Could he have developed independent initiative, using the historical blueprint for his own purposes? She moved to the mirror, the same instrument that had revealed hidden intentions in prior confrontations. Observing the reflection, she noted the positions of everyone in the room: the staff, Lord Pendleton, Fairfax, and herself. A detail she had not previously considered became apparent. The reflection of the note in the mirror showed a faint watermark, a seal distinct from the letterhead and stylistic elements of Sister Beatrice's writing. Someone had gone to the trouble of replicating the appearance of the note, embedding a signal invisible at first glance. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the implications. The final act was not just psychological manipulation, it was a calculated misdirection. Whoever had inserted the watermark had the foresight to predict every movement, every reaction, and every assumption that Miss Marple herself had relied upon to draw conclusions. This was a game of anticipation and counter-anticipation, a duel of intellects played silently within the manor's walls. The real orchestrator, Miss Marple murmured almost to herself, has remained hidden, not through absence, but by letting others act in predictable ways, ensuring that every trace points elsewhere. The final revelation is that the past manipulations were only a prelude to a present, more personal design. She turned her attention to Lord Pendleton. "My lord, consider the interactions over the past days. Every step, every reaction, every confession. Do you recall anyone who seemed particularly observant, perhaps more so than required, someone whose presence was consistently near the critical points of information?" Lord Pendleton hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There is. Lady Meredith, my cousin. She arrived during the recent family gathering, yet she has taken a keen interest in the letters, the mirror, even in Fairfax's studies. I had thought it curiosity, but now—" His voice trailed, unease evident. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Lady Meredith had been a background figure, quietly attending to family etiquette while maintaining an almost imperceptible presence at critical junctures. Her attention to detail, her subtle questions, and her apparent deference had masked a calculating intellect. Now, in the context of the last-minute revelation, it became clear that she had orchestrated the shadow layer, using Calder's instructions as a blueprint, manipulating Fairfax, guiding Mrs. Calvert, and even influencing Lord Pendleton's perceptions, all while remaining ostensibly uninvolved. "The note, my lord," Miss Marple said, "was not from Sister Beatrice alone. It was a creation of Lady Meredith, designed to provoke renewed tension and guide perception along a false path. Every subtle signal we believed to be autonomous was, in fact, part of a larger plan, executed with precision and patience." Lord Pendleton's eyes widened. But why? What could drive her to continue these schemes beyond family curiosity or concern? Miss Marple's expression was calm but firm. Power, influence, and the thrill of intellect exercised in control. She has taken Calder's psychological blueprint and turned it into her own game, orchestrating events to demonstrate her foresight, to manipulate human behavior, and to test her own ingenuity. Unlike the previous manipulations, this is no longer about legacy or historical morality. It is personal, immediate, and calculated to challenge every observer. The tension in the room rose as the realization settled over the household. Lady Meredith's subtle presence had been invisible only because it relied on the predictable assumptions of those around her. Now that the final layer of the game had been exposed, Miss Marple could anticipate the next moves, attempts at misdirection, a rush to seize documents, or perhaps even a direct confrontation to maintain control. Miss Marple prepared herself for the final confrontation, understanding that the genius of the twist lay in the invisibility of its architect. Lady Meredith's intellect, patience, and manipulation had allowed her to operate in plain sight while remaining undetected, and only the careful tracing of behavior, the subtle detection of inconsistencies, and the recognition of hidden cues had revealed the final piece of the puzzle. As she moved toward the doorway, ready to confront the hidden mastermind, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring truth of human nature. Even the most meticulous plan leaves the faintest trace, the smallest reflection, or the slightest miscalculation. It was these traces that would allow the final unraveling of a design that had stretched through the past, manipulated the present, and threatened to reshape the immediate future. The stage was set. The last-minute twist had transformed a resolved case into a dynamic confrontation of intellects. Miss Marple's insight, patience, and careful observation would now be tested one final time as the true mastermind, hiding in plain sight, prepared to reveal herself or flee, and the final threads of deception demanded resolution. The confrontation with Lady Meredith unfolded in the late afternoon, in a room that had once been filled with the gentle warmth of sunlit serenity. Now, shadows lengthened across the Persian rugs, folding over the library's corners like silent witnesses. Miss Marple had anticipated every reaction, every hesitation, every subtle ploy. Lady Meredith, upon realizing that the detective had discerned the final twist, maintained her composure with an almost imperceptible veneer of control, but her eyes betrayed the slightest flicker of unease. "I suppose you've discovered the extent of my little arrangement," Lady Meredith said, her voice smooth, almost amused, yet underscored by tension. She moved to the mirror on the table, lightly brushing the glass as if drawing strength from its reflection. "I had hoped to guide events subtly, to test human nature, to observe how one might manipulate both history and the present. And yet, here you are, unraveling every thread before I could finish the game." Miss Marple's expression was calm, serene even, yet every line of her body radiated focus. "Indeed, Lady Meredith, you have orchestrated much with remarkable subtlety. The vanishing letters, the minor misdirections, the manipulation of Fairfax and Mrs. Calvert. They were clever, but not invisible. Each micro-expression, each hesitation, each unconscious gesture was a trace. And every trace has been read, catalogued, and interpreted." Lady Meredith's lips curved in a thin, knowing smile. "Traces? Yes. But the last note was my masterpiece. It was designed to provoke renewed tension, to obscure the final step, to suggest that someone still remains at play even after the manipulations were revealed. How did you see through that?" Miss Marple gestured to the note, now carefully unfolded on the desk. A watermark, subtle but deliberate, visible only in reflection. The choice of phrasing, the timing of delivery, and the stylistic alignment with previous correspondence, all signs pointed not to Sister Beatrice alone, but to someone deeply familiar with the history and psychology of the manor. Your cleverness relied on human assumptions, that we would trust the apparent source and overlook hidden elements, but observation of behavior, timing, and micro-details revealed the truth. For the first time, Lady Meredith's smile faltered. Her eyes darted to Fairfax, then to Lord Pendleton, noting their expressions, gauging their responses. "You give yourself too much credit," she murmured. "Perhaps, but the game is not over. Even knowing the path does not mean you can control the player. Miss Marple inclined her head, undeterred. Control is not required to resolve truth. Understanding is sufficient. And in this case, understanding allows us to prevent harm, guide consequences, and acknowledge the lessons embedded in the manipulations. Yet, Lady Meredith, the choice of action is yours. Will you submit to the scrutiny you have sought to avoid, or continue to assert control by remaining at liberty? A tense silence filled the room. Lady Meredith's mind raced. She could attempt to escape, vanish into the network of corridors, or perhaps mislead the household once again. Yet the layers of observation Miss Marple had implemented were insurmountable. Every corridor, every potential hiding spot, every minor behaviour had been accounted for. Even the mirror, reflecting angles and subtle movements, provided the detective with constant oversight. In the end, Lady Meredith's pride and intellect could not entirely outweigh the inevitability of exposure. She straightened, her posture composed, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed surrender. "Very well," she said, her voice measured. "I yield. My designs are revealed. The game concluded." Miss Marple nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "The game concludes not in triumph of secrecy, but in clarity. You have demonstrated intelligence, patience, and creativity. Yet, intelligence alone cannot escape observation when patience and attention are applied in equal measure. Every subtle signal you left, every manipulation executed, was an opportunity for revelation. That opportunity has been taken." Turning to the household, she began to outline the hidden clues that had led to the revelation. The vanishing letters were not merely missing, they were a test of perception. Their precise placement and subsequent disappearance produced reactions that revealed who was acting under instruction. The mirror, used in the final confrontation, was not simply a reflective surface. It served as an observational tool, capturing gestures and angles that would betray intent. And the micro-expressions, the hesitations, and the unconscious glances, these were the footprints of deception. Fairfax listened, fascinated, though still slightly shaken. It seems almost impossible to anticipate all of that. The subtlety, the patience. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Subtlety can be observed, and patience allows patterns to emerge. What appears impossible is often merely unnoticed. Our task as observers is to see what is overlooked, to interpret what is hidden in plain sight. That is the essence of detection, and that is why even the most brilliant manipulation, when executed in view of careful scrutiny, eventually reveals itself. Lord Pendleton's face reflected relief, mingled with lingering apprehension. "And justice?" he asked softly. "Has it truly been served?" Miss Marple's gaze returned to Lady Meredith. "Justice, in its strictest sense, may be interpreted in various ways. The orchestrator of the manipulations has been revealed, the household is now safe, and the potential for further harm has been neutralized. While legal consequences may follow according to the laws of your country, the more immediate justice, truth, understanding, and prevention has been achieved. And in observing these truths, we prevent repetition of past mistakes." Lady Meredith's eyes hardened slightly, but the calculated defiance had lost its edge. "Then perhaps this is a satisfactory conclusion. For now." Miss Marple inclined her head once more, satisfied that the final layers of deception had been exposed. "For now, indeed. Yet let this serve as a reminder. The mind, clever and patient, can weave extraordinary illusions, but even the most intricate tapestry will eventually reveal the threads from which it was woven. It is the observer, attentive and patient, who discerns the pattern and ensures that truth, though delayed, is recognized." As the household settled once more into a fragile normalcy, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. The case had been extraordinary, layered with historical influence, psychological manipulation, and subtle human ingenuity. Each step had been calculated, every reaction observed, yet careful attention, persistence, and understanding had revealed the orchestrator and the executor alike. The manor, once a stage for complex deceit, now held clarity in its quiet rooms. Yet the detective knew that human nature was inexhaustible in its creativity, and while justice had been delivered today, the lessons of observation, patience, and insight would remain relevant for every mystery yet to unfold. Miss Marple finally settled into her chair, a gentle smile on her face, her hands folded over the notebook that chronicled every step. The game had concluded, the truth revealed, and justice, though nuanced, had been served. Yet the lingering shadows reminded all present that even in resolution, the echoes of cleverness, influence, and ambition could leave their mark, challenging those who sought to observe, understand, and protect. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time the detective stepped out of the courthouse. The cobblestones gleamed under the lantern light, the wet air carrying the faint scent of smoke from chimneys along the row. The trial was over, the verdict delivered, and the world, at least for the authorities, was ready to move on. But not for him. Cases never truly ended. They left threads dangling, questions whispering in the shadows. This one was no different. He pulled his collar higher against the damp wind, his eyes wandering not to the courthouse doors behind him, but to the far horizon, where the fog seemed to swallow the town whole. Justice had been served, or so they said, but as he replayed the details in his mind, there remained a sliver of unease, sharp as glass beneath the skin. The pocket watch, that infernal, seemingly insignificant trinket. It had been found, presented, even acknowledged as evidence, yet something about it remained unresolved. The engraving inside the lid, a single initial barely noticed during the heat of trial, didn't match any of the known suspects or victims. It had been filed away as irrelevant, a detail dismissed by everyone else. Everyone but him. He stopped beneath the eaves of an old tavern, rain pattering against the awning, and lit a cigarette. The match's flare threw his features into sharp relief, tired eyes, hollowed cheeks, but a mind still alight with restless calculation. He thought back to the moments before the final confrontation, the way the villain had folded under pressure, their mask cracking just enough for the truth to spill out. Yet truth, he knew, came in layers. What had been revealed might only be the surface. The watch ticked in his pocket. He had kept it, unofficially, tucked away as if it might one day speak again. And perhaps it already was. That lone initial wasn't meaningless. No such details ever were. It belonged to someone who had yet to step into the light. A soft voice broke his thoughts. "Long night, detective?" He turned to see a woman in a dark cloak, her hood drawn against the rain. She was a stranger, her face half-shrouded, her expression unreadable. He answered cautiously, "They usually are." She gave a faint smile, then nodded toward the courthouse. "You've done what many could not. The town will sleep easier now." He studied her for a beat too long, the silence stretching thin. There was something in her tone, not gratitude, not relief, but something quieter, more measured. He filed it away, the way he always did. She left without another word, disappearing into the mist. And though it would have been easy to dismiss her as just another passerby, he knew better. Coincidence rarely walked hand in hand with timing that precise. He finished his cigarette, flicked the ash into the gutter, and began walking. Each step echoed against the stones, steady, deliberate. Behind him, the courthouse loomed. Ahead, the darkness beckoned. Somewhere within it lay the answer to the question he had not yet asked. The case was closed. The file would be marked complete. But for him, the story had not reached its end. There was still that watch, still that initial, still that veiled woman who seemed to know too much. And so, as he vanished into the fog-drenched streets, the thought lingered like smoke in the lungs. Perhaps this wasn't the end at all. Perhaps this was only the beginning of another mystery, already unfolding just out of sight. The detective did not mind. For him, mysteries never ended. They only changed their shape. And in the silence of the rain, the ticking of the watch reminded him another riddle was waiting.